causes higher rates of STDs, Hall 16. As a sex worker, the risk of acquiring STIs is significantly greater. The rates of STIs are 5 to 60 times higher among sex workers than general population. In addition, sex workers are often unaware of their infection status, increasing the risk of infecting others with STI. To cross-reference this with my Heyman 91 and Snowball 18 cards, if the government is unable to protect the people from injury and violence, they become illegitimate. And when they make a decision, they're morally obligated to make the decision that to not lead the people into injury and violence, because when you would negate, you would allow prostitution, which increases STIs, which leads to higher. You wouldn't legalize adult sex work, which would lead to higher rates of STIs because you're not able to regulate the industry. And enforcing these restrictions on people restricts their freedom. Anderson 02. Regulating the performance of given activity as the ban on prostitution regulates sex takes away a certain range of choices. It is a brute necessity for most adults in our society that they earn a living by satisfying the economic demands of others. Rarely does anybody find a job in which all of one's duties are explicitly agreed to in advance. And the prohibition of prostitution actually leads to more harms than good. Anderson 02. The prohibition of prostitution exacerbates its harms. It contributes significantly to the hardships of prostitutes because it places them outside legal protection, making them extremely vulnerable to predators who would exploit their relative powerlessness. Therefore, I affirm. Stand ready for a process.
You do this part, Anthony.
Oh. How long is this?
3 minutes. You can tell I taught them. Primarily him. Good, Anthony?
Yeah, I have my stopwatch.
Okay, go.
Okay, you said that your value criterion was fulfilling government obligations.
Yes.
Okay. And what exactly are these obligations?
It's to preserve the natural rights of people and protect them from injury and violence.
Natural rights such as?
Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Okay. Okay, so moving on to your only contention is to resist the formation of an illegitimate universe.
Exactly.
Okay. And you mentioned STIs a lot and STDs.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So what is the link between voting negative and increasing STIs?
Because because these sex workers, they are put into these, because if you have regulations on the industry allowing, because if you look at
Who regulates the industry?
What?
Who's going to regulate the industry?
It would be the government.
Okay.
Because a lot of the sexual activity that happens is unprotected, which would lead to higher levels of intercourse, high levels of disease and STIs. So when you allow government regulations to increase the levels of protection used, you're preventing more injury and violence, fulfilling the government's law.
He's in the beginning part, and Jackson was trying to say something. What were you saying?
Speak louder for Mo.
Oh, can you repeat that?
Okay. Basically, right now, a lot of what's happening with adult sex work is the intercourse is unprotected, causing increases of levels of STIs. But in the act world, where we can regulate these industries and make sure that protection is always used, and make sure that STIs aren't transmitted, then we reduce the amount of injury that happens to people, and the government fulfills its obligation, not becoming.
When we increase the chance of STIs, because as it becomes more common, obviously if we legalize it, it's going to become more common. Yeah.
But we can make it safe.
But in whenever you balance it out, does it really make it that much safer? And then you know what I'm trying to say, right?
No.
Okay. So if we increase the chance of getting STIs and we increase the protection, and if you increase both of them, does it really tip the scale?
Yes, because currently you have around 55% of engaging in unprotected sexual activity right now, and so if you're able to regulate that and make sure prostitutes are not able to do their job unless they use protection, then you'll make sure that the percentage will decrease, reducing injury.
Okay. We're starting with it.
10 seconds.
Nice.
Is that all?
Sure. I probably had more stuff that I wanted to ask, but I forget. 7 minutes?
Yeah, you get 7 minutes, Anthony.
Can't read for 7 minutes.
Oh boy.
Okay, I'm sorry, Jack.
I'm pretty sure I said this morning I wasn't ready. That's right. I have to film myself.
Are you taking prep time or are you speaking?
I should probably take prep time, right?
Are you taking prep right now?
No. I'm drawing a line on my paper. Does that count as prep?
No, just
I'll
please
just say something else.
start speaking
Okay.
from the podium.
Okay, it's just looking at you? Yeah, okay. That looks good.
This podium is just loud.
Oh boy.
Oh, yeah. Now let's move. Are you ready? Yeah. Did you say yes?
Yes.
Okay, I negate the resolution. The United States ought to legalize adult sex. For this debate, we should and have to value morality, as the word ought is explicitly used in the resolution. Ought is defined as used to describe moral obligation by Merriam-Webster's dictionary. So it makes sense to be the only reasonable value. Open Society Foundation claims that the majority of sex workers only go into sex work because it's the best and only option that they have. American philosopher Edward Freeman claimed that the gap between the rich and poor has increased more rapidly due to the adoption of capitalism around the world. Capitalism fails for the majority, only aiding the top fraction of people. In order to create a just and moral world, we mustn't forget the majority. For this reason, my value criterion is resisting capitalism.
Louder.
Okay. I forget what it was. For this reason, oh wait, I already read that. The idea of capitalism only goes to reinforce the reality that some are meant to be poor and others are meant to be rich. Capitalism doesn't work because it doesn't distribute wealth on a basis of need. Okay. By voting affirmative, we only work to reinforce capitalism. Thus, we have no choice but to vote for the negative. Wickman 11 views prostitutes as victims of the capitalist system, and the abolition of prostitution is as a necessary part of ending capitalism. Highly 19 sex work under capitalism is shaped by exploitation and oppression. Work done under capitalism is exploitative, and the vast majority of it is done in conditions shaped by forms of oppression. Sex work is no exception. Keep 16 states sex work can be the only choice for some people, or a stepping stone towards financial independence. Sex work is one of the few jobs in which women can make more than men. This is, of course, a side effect of a capitalist society. Cockshot in 17 says, when brothel keeping is illegal, the majority of prostitutes are independent and are sexually but not economically exploited. When brothel keeping is legalized, capitalist business come to dominate the trade, meaning that an economic exploitation becomes combined with an intensified sexual exploitation. So my contention is that capitalism is bad and should exist. What? Oh, what are you looking at me? Okay, capitalism causes structural violence. Center for Health Equity Research in Chicago defines structural violence as the multiple ways in which social, economic, and political systems expose particular populations to risk and vulnerabilities, leading to increased mortality. Structuralviolence.org. Structural violence may lead to death, but just as often it may manifest in forms that are not as positive as they could be. Accumulated effects of structural violence on an individual will necessarily mean less health and a shorter life. Gordon 96. Competition encouraged by capitalists and their government fractures community spirit, and the winner of economic competition imposes suffering on the losers. Capitalism means violence, the pollution of environmental violence, and the maintained unemployment of structural violence. Each 12 states. Structural violence. Examples include hunger or disease caused by food and medicine being too expensive. When such violence leads to large numbers of death, he argues, we must call it structural genocide. Capitalism, by its very nature, deprives hundreds of millions of people of the necessities of life. Just one example, every 3 seconds, a baby dies of a preventable disease or hunger, and in the same 3 seconds, military organizations spend $120,000. Over 10 million people are killed every year by capitalism's structural genocide. Songen 15 states that capitalism is almost undoubtedly the most violent economic system of recent times, responsible for more deaths and more social disruption than any other. So essentially what we see here is that capitalism is very obviously a negative system. It's bad. So by voting for the negative, we work essentially against capitalism. And the link here is that voting for the affirmative works to uphold capitalism. And the debate here today is about what we should do. And what we should do, should we look at the impacts that are held whenever we vote for the affirmative and vote for the negative. And obviously the impacts of voting for the affirmative I've already outlined here, and I can continue to outline, but they're very negative, and so we have to vote for the negative. All right, I guess I can. Capitalism causes environmental degradation. Dominant capitalist economic system has contributed to the breaching of several ecological boundaries in relation to climate change, biodiversity loss, nutrient enrichment, and damaging the natural systems that sustain it. Frank Magdoff and Why Capitalism is Toxic to the Environment. Toxic. For those involved in environmental struggles, there's no meaningful discussion around the idea that the very economic system under which we operate might be overriding the cause of ecological problems. Naomi Klein has put it, the ecological crisis is the highest expression of the capitalist threat. Many environmentalists admit that the way capitalism is currently working is a major cause of ecological destruction. All sorts of solutions are proposed that leave the system intact. However, individual capitalists are engaged in a production and exchange for the sake of the immediate profit. As long as the individual sells a commodity or a manufactured item, he is satisfied and does not concern himself with what afterwards becomes of the commodity and its purchasers. The same thing applies for the natural effects of the same animals. Present mode of production is predominantly concerned only about the immediate and the most tangible result. Okay, so I guess I'll talk about Sid. Where's my flow? It's over there. All right, so Sid talks about, or my opponent talks about how voting for the negative will reduce the amount of STIs and STDs because the government will be able to regulate it. However, right now, the only location in the U.S. where sex work is legal is in Nevada, and locations in Nevada. And other locations, obviously sex work isn't legal. Okay, STDs, yeah. But whenever we increase the amount, obviously if we vote affirmative, we increase the amount of sex workers. If we increase the amount of sex workers, we increase the risk of STDs for these sex workers. Now, how much time do I have? Basically out of time. But by regulating the system, it will decrease the amount of STDs, but in on the scale, it doesn't really matter because they're increasing both of them. So at the same time, the amount of people who come out of this having these STDs and these negative effects on them kind of doesn't change. That's bad. Is that time?
Process time, right?
Yep, cross.
Do you mind if I move back? I just feel weird being right here. Topic.
I'll just sit. I'll
Yeah,
just go
just-
over here then. Is this better?
Yeah, I just feel weird being like that.
Just look down at your paper.
Okay.
You have to look at me while
Okay, starting with your case. Okay, so you talk a lot. You mentioned Whitman. You talk about how sex work has an exploitative nature and leads to capitalism. But what's the warrant for this? Why is an exploitative nature lead to capitalism? Why? What in that is capitalist? What's the reason for it? Because you say. Because your Whitman 11 card, your card after that said sex work is exploitative and has capitalistic nature, but why?
Because most people who go into sex work as a job are generally people who don't have the money to, and so they go into this thinking the only thing that they have in mind is to make money, and so they're more easily exploited.
But isn't prostitution a way that's helping the poor? So you're saying capitalism is bad because
In a capitalist society,
it keeps the poor. But if prostitution is a way for the poor to make money, doesn't it prevent the poor from staying poor?
What do you mean?
If capitalism helps poor people make money, if adult sex work helps poor people make money, isn't it not capitalistic?
But it's hurting these people while they're making money. And so the idea is in a system where they don't need to make money anymore, this all goes away.
So in the next world where prostitution is not legalized, capitalism doesn't exist. and prostitution is
I'm
the
not saying
reason.
that capitalism doesn't exist, but I'm saying that we should resist capitalism.
Okay, so you're saying the way we should resist capitalism is by if we illegalize if we continue what's happening in most areas of the U.S. and illegalize prostitution, that allows us for a moral world where capitalism doesn't exist.
No, we resist capitalism, which is
But how is that related to the resolution? How is resisting capitalism related to
because
prostitution?
the impacts of voting affirmative on capitalism, or impacts of voting affirmative on this resolution, is upholding capitalism.
So you're saying
And
when
what
we
we're going to do is the opposite.
so you're saying when we stop prostitution, we stop capitalism.
No, I'm saying we resist capitalism.
Okay. So
Stop looking at me.
what's your how does capitalism lead to structural violence?
So basically, these people don't have as much money to buy things, and so I mentioned structural violence is whenever people can't afford things like medicine, they can't afford like certain necessities, right? So we need to keep it.
No, that's fine.
Okay.
So food and medicine. So what would these people do if they? So these people they have no other job to turn to, correct?
Yes, that's why.
So if food and medicine being too expensive is capitalistic, if we don't provide them an option to work, isn't that being capitalistic by not having them be able to make money to pay for food?
If we don't require them to have to pay for these certain necessities in life, then they won't need a job.
Okay.
Get water. I guess you wouldn't want to drink. Never mind. I'm thirsty.
Yeah, all this one, bro.
Do you have water, Jackson?
I don't know.
Oh, water. You're okay with that?
Whatever. I don't really care, to be honest.
You wouldn't care.
No, I wouldn't.
Didn't you do that earlier at lunch? I remember at lunch you were just
Oh wait, Anthony, what was the author on the capitalism race that leads to environmental degradation?
There's a couple. I read it really fast. There's Fred Magdoff, Juniper. Did I read this?
Wait, what was the date on the Magdoff card?
It's a good question.
Okay.
I don't know how to list it. I think I had another Magdoff card. 11.
Are you keeping track of your prep, Sid?
Yeah, I have 140 units.
I have a question. Are you allowed to bring up more stuff in the 2NR?
You're not supposed to.
Okay. Because I know you can't in the 2AR, right? Because if you do, then they don't have a chance to respond to it. But my thought is, if you bring it up in the 2NR, don't they still have a chance to respond?
I mean, yes. Don't make anything completely new in the 2NR. If you were to do like a logical extrapolation of a previous argument, that's fine.
Extrapolation is,
continuation of.
like
But don't just-
weight or something?
Don't start reading new art. Don't be like capitalism leads to. But let's imagine you didn't read capitalism leads to environmental collapse.
And then all of a sudden I did.
Yeah, don't do that in the 2NR. But if you just wanted to say, here are the impacts of environmental collapse in the 2NR, then you're like, then sure. That's an extrapolation. That's a continuation.
Okay.
Have a
So if
previous
I
one.
mention something and I can continue it into
Also, speaking of extrapolation, all of you stuff about sex workers and STIs increasing, that was all analytical, right?
yeah.
I was running.
you look at my
background
case,
episodes
wait.
too.
Just wait. If you look at my case, somewhere in here it's like generic cards on why sex work should be legalized. In parentheses, STIs.
Oh, and to be clear,
fab.
you should probably ask the judge if they're okay with flex prep before you do it.
What is flight prep?
asking each other's questions during prep. Like I am cool with that.
But like normally I chat because like
Oh yeah, a ton of judges especially local, will say no to that.
Okay.
So make sure that you ask.
General cards on why sex work should be legal, parentheses, STIs, FEM, etc.
And like you're allowed to refuse to answer during prep
The
if
only
you
thing
don't like
under
it.
it, not gonna find cards for this because I could be napping instead. So yeah, all of it was analytical.
Let's go.
Okay, cool.
What's the order?
I will be addressing the 1AC, then going to the 1AC and 1. I'll be addressing the 1AC, the 1 and R, and the 1 things.
So AFNEG?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Catch it.
Okay, is everybody ready?
I gotta text my dad. Are you staying late at school? Can you give me a ride?
I should, yeah.
Because my dad's probably gonna be sleeping.
Yeah, I can do right.
Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Okay, first addressing my framework. My opponent did not address my value at all, so, and especially the Live 15 cards, which specifically weights justice over morality. Therefore, that's a card specifically saying that justice is better because it ends up resulting in overall better physical and social well-being. So you can flow that through the round, and then because that helps further support my value criterion, that the government has to fulfill its obligation to prevent against injury and violence. My opponent also didn't respond to that, so therefore that can also flow. And then on his response to my government regulation, he simply responds that he uses for his own analytical extrapolation of that as sex workers increases, STIs would increase. He's not taking into consideration that these STIs are caused by unprotected sex, and that in the African world we have the government has an obligation to prevent against injury by regulating this industry and providing protection for that. Therefore, none of his claims are accurate because the government okay, the government. Well, we'll come back to that. Okay, now to my on capitalism. In Crossix, he had said that I had asked him a question about food, about having food and medicine being too expensive. And his response was, the next world is a world where this food and medicine is not too expensive and people don't have to resort to prostitution. So why don't you do both and the next plan, not plan, what the next proposes to do? Because he provided no specific. He said that prostitution is adds to capitalism, but he never actually quantifies this and says how much it strictly adds to capitalism. Because the benefits of it just completely outweigh the proposed harms. Because you have those reduced STI rates, you preserve sexual autonomy, and you keep the government legitimate. So therefore, when you're doing both, you're getting the best of both worlds. And then also onto its value criteria of resisting capitalism. Capitalism solves warming. Empirics prove capitalism solves warming. Rosenberg 17. In a modern capitalist economy, far from being that jungle that fallen climb betray it, business is subject to regulation. Societal values and forces beyond control may fight back and sometimes fight back nasty, but it accepts the outcome. Take the energy crisis of the early 1970s, which combined all these factors and in some respects echoed the dilemmas facing businesses in the era of global warming. Suddenly, OPEC raised oil prices, but rather than threaten war as relatives who see no balance of capitalist savings for consumers, because that's what the market demanded. Government stepped in with regulations that filled in the gaps where the market wouldn't. It worked. If the government used per unit of GDP in the United States was still at 1973 levels, the country's energy use would equal 40% greater than its current level, contributing to global warming. Therefore, capitalism. My opponent had all these claims about capitalism leading to climate change and global warming with his Magdoff 11 cards. But you can see through historical and empirical evidence that capitalism actually causes businesses to grow and adapt to the business climate, and then in turn save the climate. And then next, onto all of his points about the exploitative nature, that it allows these sex workers to be exploited. Again, in the African world, the government would have regulations on what prostitutes and sex workers are allowed and not allowed to do. Therefore, this exploitative nature would not exist in the African world, and I affirm.
So,
Are you running prep, Anthony?
Who would be a good African nation to
For which committee?
for any of the general assemblies?
Good African nation.
Who's on the Security Council right now? That's what I should.
Oh, I think it's like Kosovo or something.
Cote d'Ivoire.
African?
Is Cote d'Ivoire an
No,
African?
sorry, yeah, Kosovo is not African.
Is Cote d'Ivoire African?
Wait,
Cote
Anthony,
d'Ivoire,
keep
yeah.
tracking your bro.
I didn't use any yet, but I'm looking up Cote d'Ivoire. Is Cote d'Ivoire? Yeah, Cote d'Ivoire. No, wasn't that in the Security Council? Wasn't that you?
No.
Or that was Cecilia at like Riverview. Oh wait, no. Someone was Cote d'Ivoire. Cote.
I was Kosovo on Security Council review.
Someone
That's-
was Cote d'Ivoire in the Security Council.
Wait, no, I was Kuwait. Kosovo is in Africa. Wait, where's Kosovo?
Just stop. Just
Kosovo is not in Africa.
Where's Kosovo?
stop. Just save me the trouble.
Kosovo's in Europe, dude. Alright, yeah, I'll run that.
Equatorial Guinea.
I wasn't actually prepping, so.
Oh.
South Africa. I think that's a good pick. How about
Yeah,
that?
South Africa. Maybe like Morocco. Morocco's generally okay.
Is this for Cecilia?
Well, I'm just looking for UVA Security Council, maybe a country preference there.
I just want to say, I really want Roscosmos for the 2025 space race. I know because the thing is, everyone else is gonna try to go to China and the U.S. and kill each other. But I'm just gonna like make Russia great again. It's gonna be wonderful.
Roscosmos.
Yes. For WGSS. And I know a lot of people want to be on that. So
Well, so what I'm putting in for UVA, 3 General Assembly delegations, 2 each. So that's for probably
6.
people with relatively less experience.
Mhm.
It gives them something to have. 6 in the specialized agencies, 5 in the crisis committees, 2 in the ad hoc, which is the Jefferson Tennessee Systems thing, and 5 in the Wilson Global Systems.
what is that, like 24 kids?
So
That sounds good.
you gotta get all 24 seats filled though.
We haven't had a problem getting seats filled for
Well,
UVA
we're-
last 2
yeah, we
years.
have.
Have we? UVA seats? I thought last year there were like 30 responses at the form and like 20.
Well, we're just gonna need to make sure we have all 24 filled.
Okay,
I mean,
price wise.
and that's just one of those things where, hey guys, you know, we gotta cover the 24 seats or else,
Mhm.
you know, because price, but then also like we're paying for those 24
Yeah.
seats. You gotta pay up front, so. So countries I picked are France, China, Canada, Russia, and South Africa.
For GAs?
Yeah.
That's good, yeah.
That's good.
A good mix.
Since Felix isn't here to have any input, so.
I'm fine being the shadow head delegate.
We have this on video recording.
That's fine.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sending it to Mona. Mona doesn't.
So,
I
I
don't
mean,
think Mona
hey,
really cares.
if you're not here, you don't get a say. That's why you have to be here. Even if you are here at
No, I didn't prep
practice.
at all.
Felix
Still
not-
had 4 minutes.
Oh,
I'm
wait,
only
Felix
very
is
end.
here too, right?
He is the QR.
Because earlier I was looking up African countries. I didn't count that.
But I
We've
just
been
want to
doing
get
the
all
last 2
UVA
minutes then.
stuff started. Yeah.
Circling stuff. See this? I wrote this in pink, but it's supposed to be blue because that's what I'm supposed to say. And so,
You know you're running prep right now, right?
yeah, I know. I'm still going to.
We're gonna have to have a pretty big LV group meeting after this.
Okay,
Sage, you're doing pretty well.
this is rough. Also, like I,
Yeah.
case I had like I haven't had enough time.
Well, yeah, not a lot of prep, and you know,
I'm also
no, I understand when your opponents are bad and you were.
I was going to say I'm just really rusty because it's been like a month. Like
Well, yeah,
a
you're
month
rusty,
and
but
two-
also it's just like
today.
you know when they're
It was
obviously.
funny. So Sid was like, he was just
Grab
talking. Okay, well, I want to.
Oh shoot.
You still didn't read an alt, by the way. Like
That's true.
you were supposed to do that.
I'm gonna say.
I sent you multiple alternatives.
I'm gonna keep this.
Please don't uncap during the year.
Can you revoke emails? So,
30 seconds.
are you allowed to revoke?
What do you mean revoke emails?
If you send an email and you suck it back up.
You mean unsend?
Yeah.
You can like for like the 10 seconds after you send it if you set that up.
Anyways, what I was saying was when Sid went up there and he started talking, you know, he was just like going off like the cusp and he was just talking. And then all of a sudden, he starts reading his card, and his speed goes from like 100 to like 250 right away. And I'm just
That was not 250.
Well, I don't know. Who do you think I am? Like Mick
Like,
Jagger? I
probably
can't
not,
count
like,
words per minute.
150.
I would have put it at 200.
Just start speeding.
I'm not doing this, but I think that maybe the summer too is really nice.
Like 6 minutes?
Thumbs up means yeah.
I wasn't looking.
We made eye contact.
I was looking at your eyes, not your hand. Anyways. Alright. Are you ready?
Order.
Oh. Whatever order I'm sorry. No, it's probably what he said and then what he said. Just gonna talk about what he said probably. And if I have time, I'll.
Oh, just go. Let's get this over with.
I'll mention that last actually. Okay, are you ready? Are you actually ready?
We've been ready for a while now.
Are you ready?
Yeah, I'm ready.
You didn't say anything. I literally said, are you
You don't have to wait for your opponent, just go.
Oh, then why did people say it?
Just go! To be polite. You don't have to.
Oh, I thought that was like a thing that you had to do. Alright, okay, so my opponent talks about perm do both and the idea of like doing both, but that's just not possible. As I mentioned earlier, like prostitution and sex work and capitalism aren't necessarily like separable, if that's a word. And so you can't really have an affirmative world where capitalism isn't at the either. It also goes on to mention how I mentioned that in the neg world is like free of. So in cross-examination, he talks about how he mentions that in the neg world, I state that in the neg world that food and medicine and all this stuff is free, or it doesn't cost money for these people. But I never actually said that. I just said that the idea is to work towards a world that's like that. And in the neg world, it might not be like that, but in the neg world, we move closer towards a world that is like that, and that's the end goal of this. But in the frame of this resolution, in the scope of this resolution, that's all we can do right now, and that's what we should do. Moving on to my opponent, who talks about the exploitative nature of how I talk about the exploitative nature, and he states that these people aren't actually being exploited and blah blah, and so. Okay, I forget what I was saying. The Cockshot in 17 states that for a large section of prostitutes, even the fiction of legal freedom does not exist. While those arose with slavery and trafficked women are still abused in them across the world. Liberal apologists claim that the legalization of prostitution will reduce trafficking, but the evidence is against them. This statistical study covering 150 countries show that legalizing prostitution is correlated with an increase in human trafficking. So this is essentially what I'm talking about whenever I say exploitative nature. First, economic exploitative, but also sexual exploitative nature. The evidence here already shows in my Cockshot 17 card that in a study over 150 countries, there's a correlation between legalizing prostitution, legalizing sex work, adult sex work, is correlated with an increase in human trafficking. Are you laughing? I also mentioned earlier in my first speech that whenever brothels are legal and whenever sex work is legal, capitalist business comes to dominate the trade, meaning that economic exploitation and sexual exploitation are combined together. That only works to make things worse. Also have here a Stefan, I don't know how you say her name, a sex worker shares her story online and essentially talks about, she says here that had I been in a more financially desperate situation, I probably would have seen the abusive guy again. Now that's just a quote from what she said, But what we see here is, again, sexual exploitative nature. Again, if she had been in a more financially desperate situation, which I'm sure a lot of these sex workers in the current day are, if they're in an exploitative, they're being exploited, and she would have had to go back to this quote unquote abusive guy, which she outlines in her narrative. Moving on, my opponent talks about my environmental cards, and you read something. You read too fast, so I'm going to pay attention. But I'm going to read some stuff too. So, Stephens in 13 states that the capitalist system itself is incapable of mitigating the total threat posed by global warming, and instead precipitates this grim eventuality due to its incessant need for ceaseless expansion and profit. It is the world's poor who so far have suffered the most from capitalism's degradation of the climate. 2,000 Kenyan farmers who killed themselves upon the failure of rains in 2008, 260,000 Somalis murdered in 2011 famine that followed from the worst drought in like 7 decades. The ever-increasing annual death toll for which capital-induced climate destabilization is responsible will cause the deaths of millions or even billions in what may well develop into the extermination of humanity altogether. What else did Sid say? Oh yeah, so Sid talks about how I don't mention his value of justice, and in cross-examination I talked to him about this, and he defines justice as like the obligation or a just obligation of the government, essentially to like mitigate violence that is done against the people and to protect the people. But essentially what happens here is if we vote for the affirmative, I talked about this in my structural violence cards. Is structural violence not violence? Because it has the word violence in it, so I'm just going to assume that it is. So by voting for the affirmative, we increase structural violence, and that is working against what Sid's idea of the government is supposed to be doing. And so I still went under the idea of justice. Sethness in 13, in reference to medicine in Africa, capitalism's structurally genocidal nature, in a chapter examining Africa south of the Sahel. It is the world's region that has been most severely impacted by capital's genocidal imperatives. Consider the millions who succumb to AIDS on the continent each year, and the other millions who perish to the region annually due to a lack of medicine treatment. All this deprivation is exacerbated, argues Leach, by food aid regimes overseen by wealthier societies, which in the U.S. demands that the food be purchased from and shipped by U.S. companies, effectively removing full half of the total resources intended for the country. Oh yeah, and so essentially what we see here is that by voting for affirmative, we increase structural violence, and structural violence is not good. So just to go down everything again, keep voting. Is that what they're called? KPIs or something. So by voting for the negative, we work to resist against a capitalist society. And although the negative world isn't essentially the world that we should live in, it works towards a world that we should live in. And that's essentially what we should be working towards. And so by voting for the affirmative, we move towards more of a capitalist society. That's bad. So I'm making the resolution.
You running prep, Sid?
Yeah. Wait, one for you.
What? 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 Use your words. He's prepping. Shh. Wish I knew.
Want me to tell you? I had a card in 18 about environmental degradation.
We're just going to stay on the podium while I make this speech.
Could you stand up so you're speaking towards the laptop?
Can I sit next to you?
No, I was saying that as a joke. I'm going to stand on the
Yeah, you're gonna stand on the podium.
Yes, I'm going to stand on the laptop.
I approve this plan of action. Let's go.
It's pretty sturdy. Can I sit next to you? No, because you'll be on top. We'll inevitably end up pushing each other. We'll fall over. Zainab's also going to her open house.
And Rajiv,
Is he?
did you read the messages?
I'm fine to come if folks are needed. Oh, he says what time?
Also, our lab leader at SDI, he used the word folks to refer to a group of people a lot. And now Rajiv,
Was he like,
he wasn't really something that I don't really know about. But now, ever since then, Rajiv has pretty much exclusively used the word folks.
you know, the guy, Mr. Kotek, who I did like my PJS stuff?
Mr.
with
Kotek.
for a few years? Yeah. He also says folks, but I don't think he's still there. I think he's been always in Pittsburgh.
But yeah, Rajiv was like, when he talks about a group of people, like, even like a group of people like black people or trans people, it's like black folks and trans folks. And I'm like, Rajiv.
Oh, really?
Yeah. That's where Rajiv uses it, and it's interesting.
I got it.
Okay, okay,
You ready? Yeah, I'm ready.
3 minutes only.
Ready to get over with this.
Okay, so go. Okay, so my opponent says prostitution or adult sex work is just part of capitalism, but then he says in his 2NR that prostitution and capitalism are not separable. So essentially, what he's saying there is that prostitution that with capitalism and prostitution has to come with it. But as we see in the current status quo of the U.S., that just because we have illegalized prostitution, capitalism is not rampant, and all of its impacts are not happening. So, but really, what matters here is, so yeah, he had some responses about justice and and how he fit under fulfilling the government's obligation, but if you really look at one C, he never had any real response. He never really responded on that, and so in the AF world, the AF is preserving the government's obligation. That's what you have to decide the round on, because he has not refuted any of my points on his framework, so that's what we're deciding the round on. And in the AF world, we are stopping these STIs through that government regulation. Any instance he gives is either a situation where prostitution is illegalized or not regulated. The government has an obligation to legalize prostitution and regulate it. That's what it should be doing. So therefore, you have to vote AF to be able to do this. And then in this world, my opponent has never refuted any of my sexual autonomy claims. If you look at all of my framework cards, it's saying when you take away rights from people, it leads to dehumanization. So
we talk about slippers.
when
My cock shot. Where'd you ignore that?
Stop.
so the rule, because in the net rule, you take away from the rule of government. In the AF rule, you're protecting it through that regulation, preventing STIs, and the preserving those natural rights. Because above all else, even in this cap world, none of his impacts compared to this. Because on this large level, he's not providing any. All his examples, all his refutes are not an example of what we are trying to achieve or what we should achieve in the AF world. So therefore, you have to go AF to keep the government a legitimate government and preserve its obligation. Therefore, I affirm. That was one of the worst 2 AOs that we had.
Okay, I'm gonna look over my flow for a second. I'll just keep it running.
Not
So you
only
guys.
did someone peel them off, but they didn't even peel all 4. Just got 3 of them.
Or maybe 3 of them just fell off.
Does that happen?
I don't know.
You were the tech desk. Did you play with these things like all day? How much did you get paid?
Minimum wage.
Oh yeah, it's like the other day. You went down. You literally left your job for an hour.
No, I did as much work as I could.
And then you came back and you clocked out. You stole, what is it, 725? You stole 725 from the
Steal
people.
725.
You stole 725. Not from the school, from
I
the
clocked
people.
out because I was done working.
My parents taxed me.
I clocked out.
It's
at
like a
3
cent.
I clocked out at 3:30. No, I was done at 3:30. Like I left the school at 3:30, and Sean had left already.
When did you clock out? You said you clocked out at 4.
Yeah, I left at 3:30.
So you stole money.
No.
Is that not still?
I was still
Well, I mean, if you had stayed there,
available to the public or possible.
if you had,
Henry.
you guys are still here. If you had stayed
Yeah,
there,
we just had the debate.
if you had stayed there, what would you have done? Would you have done anything even?
No, I would have just been doing.
Okay.
So you would have stolen our.
Are you guys ready for the results? As reluctant as I am to say this, and I now realize it actually gives no hint as to who I'm about to vote for, I voted Anthony.
What? Why?
Yeah, so I really didn't want to, because
you didn't have an oath.
no, because
Andrew, you didn't read
I
an
didn't.
oath.
Yeah,
I didn't hit the right point.
Why didn't you?
yeah.
mention
So
my oath? Why didn't you mention
here's
you
why.
don't have
First
an
of all, I think Anthony wins framework. You're right that he didn't respond to justice over morality, but the one in our argument about how structural violence is violence and
Yeah.
it will outweigh. Your response to that is he didn't make a response to the one in C.
Yeah.
Not that your STI and STD violence will outweigh that.
I was
So-
afraid because you said I couldn't bring you stuff up in the.
No, that I allowed that. I gave you that.
So
How
there,
come
there,
I can do that and not say something
Because
else?
it's not a new argument, it's a framing of previous arguments that have been made.
Okay.
It's not something completely new.
So-
And then the other thing was, he is winning his environment stuff with Cap. So when you say none of his impacts compared to STDs, I think extinction from climate change outweighs.
should I?
You would. I think you really should have focused on the fact that you were 100% winning your STDs advantage. Like you were definitely winning that you stopped them
Mhm.
because he didn't really extend his responses there. So if I were you, I would have focused on that. I would have focused on the perm. I thought the perm made sense.
And it's developing a toner.
And I would have focused more on how really incoherent the critique was.
Okay.
Because what the critique was a critique of the status quo. He doesn't tell us whether or not prostitution will be
Yeah,
legalized.
'cause I said like one sentence on that, but like
Yeah,
I didn't
like,
really see
it's really vague. Like, is prostitution legalized in the world of the negative? I have absolutely no idea, right? So you should tell me, how are you as a judge supposed to weigh impacts when you don't even know what his world is, right?
Okay.
The only thing you know for certain is that the affirmative reduces STDs. You do not know if his anti-capitalist action works. You do not know if it abolishes prostitution eventually. The only certain thing in this round is my impact, which means it definitely outweighs any of his very improbable ones. Does that make sense?
So like there, I should be going for more of like the probability and time frame arguments rather than like.
I wouldn't call it probability and time frame. I would just say it's vague. I don't know what he does. You don't know what he does either. You know what I do. You should feel very comfortable voting for me and at least knowing that it's better than the status quo.
Okay.
He hasn't proved to you that the voting F uniquely makes capitalism worse, right? At the very worst, it's the status quo but better, right?
Oh my god.